Alhamdulillah wahdahu wa salawatu rabbi wa salamuhu ala ashraf al-anbiya'i wa man tabi'ahu wa ba'd. Allahumma faqihna fi ad-din wa 'allimna at-ta'wil wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-'ali al-'azim. So to continue inshallah with Is'af al-Murideen li'iqamati fara'id ad-din by Shaykh Abdul Ghani al-Ghunaymi al-Maydani rahimahullah ta'ala. And we in the previous lesson we stopped having completed the prophetically recommended acts of the wudu, so the ablution, and now we're going to look at the prophetically recommended acts of ghusl, so the ritual bathing or showering, and likewise tayammum, so the ritual dry ablution, and then we are going to go on to purification from tangible literal impurities. So he says ويسن في الغسل أيضا التسمية والنية وغسل اليدين ونجاسة لو كانت على بدنه بانفرادها ثم الوضوء كوضوء الصلاة. So he says now that these acts that he's going to mention are prophetically recommended, i.e. they were acts carried out by the Prophet ﷺ, but they were not mentioned in the ayah, which gives indication to the furud of ghusl. So anything which came in the ayah, they are used to show the furud, and this is in relation to wudu and ghusl, and likewise the tayammum, it's explained by the sunnah, and anything which is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ but was not mentioned in the ayah. So in the ayah, in kuntum junuban fattaharu, so it's very explicit, fattaharu, so purify yourself, with an emphasis on the ta', meaning to place extra emphasis on purification of the body. And the fuqaha al-ahnaf, they take from this anything which can be purified, washed, which is apparent, including the inside of the nose and the mouth, as we mentioned, is to be done so, and that which is mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ is to be considered a sunnah. So he says at-tasmiyah, number one, the mentioning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name, and as we mentioned in wudu, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, or Bismillah al-Azim, walhamdulillah ala din al-Islam, or that which is praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so la ilaha illallah, and something of the sort. Wa-niyya, the intention. So the intention in ghusl is sunnah, just as it is sunnah in the wudu. And we mentioned why, because it's not explicitly referred to in the verse, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu idha qumtum ila salati faghsilu wujuhakum wa aydiyakum. And the other madhahib, they would say that the part idha qumtum is in reference to the niyyah, but the ahnaf, they do not agree with this, and so the niyyah is seen as a recommended act. And we also mentioned that it is because it's a condition for the salah, like the other conditions, and intention is not required for the condition to be considered valid. The intention is needed, though it's necessary if a person wants his act of purification to be ibadah. Then he says وَغَسْلُ الْيَدَيْنِ, and washing the hands. So this is prior to starting the ghusl, because of course it's fard to wash the hands when washing the body. So that when washing the hands as a part of the fard, it's included in the entire body, so it's considered a part of the body. But here it's recommended prophetically to wash the hands prior to starting the ghusl. Why? In case there is any najasa on the hands, etc. Even if there's no najasa on the hands, it's still recommended. Then he says وَنَجَاسَةٍ لَوْ كَانَتْ عَلَى بَدِنِهِ بِانْفِرَادِهَا, likewise to wash any remnants of impurity which may be on the body prior to washing the body. So let's say, for example, a person may have some sort of impurity on their body on a particular place. They wash it off prior to starting to wash the rest of the body. And Sheikh Sa'id Baktash, he mentions here fil ibtida, in reference to this particular part, i.e. in the beginning of the ghusl, لِيَطْمَئِنَّ بِزَوَالِهَا قَبْلَ أَن تُشِيعَ عَلَى جَسَدِهِ, so that he has tranquility of the heart. He's certain that that impurity is not going to spread to the rest of the body. And he mentions that he took this from Raqi al-Falah ala Nur al-Idah. Then he says ثُمَّ الْوَضُوءُ كَوَضُوءِ الصَّلَاةِ, and then to perform the ablution just as he performs the ablution for wudu. So after a person has done the tasmiyah and he has the intention and he's washed his hands and he's then washed any impurities that are on the body, he then performs wudu. Then ثُمَّ يُفِيضُ الْمَاءُ عَلَى بَدَنِهِ ثُمَّ يُفِيضُ الْمَاءَ عَلى بَدَنِهِ ثَلَاثًا, then he pours the water over himself 3 times. وَيَبْتَدِئُ بِصَبِّ الْمَاءِ بِرَأْسِهِ, starting with his head, then his shoulders, starting with the right side and the left side. وَيَدْلُكُ جَسَدًا, and he should also make sure to scrub his body, so to rub the water in, to scrub the body. And this should be considered something which is done at all times. it should be something which is done out of precaution at all times to make sure that the water has reached all parts of the body. And whilst a person is performing the ghusl, they should make sure to pay attention to any particular areas of the body that may not be, the water may not reach unless they place emphasis on that part. So for example, the navel area, under the arms, etc., making sure that the water reaches the roots of the hair and so on and so forth. And they go into much further detail in larger, more advanced books, so they'll give indication to that which was mentioned, i.e. for example, a woman who has plaited her hair and things like that. And as we said previously, that which is advanced or that which is intermediate, we will leave it for the intermediate or the advanced books. Then he says, وَيُسَنُّ فِي التَّيَمُّمْ التَّسْمِيَةُ وَالتَّرْتِيبُ وَالْمَوَالَاةُ وَإِقْبَالُ الْيَدَيْنِ وَإِدْبَارُهُمَا بَعْدَ وَضْعِهِمَا فِي التُّرَابِ وَتَفْرِيجُ أَصَابِعِهِمَا وَنَفْضُهُمَا. So he says it's also prophetically recommended, i.e. it has been mentioned the Prophet ﷺ used to do these things in Tayamum at-Tasmiyah. So starting with the Tasmiyah, mentioning the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالتَّرْتِيب, likewise following the order referenced in the ahadith. وَالْمُوَالَاةِ, likewise making sure that a person goes directly from one limb to another. So after having wiped the face, going on to the arms, etc. وَإِقْبَالُ الْيَدَيْنِ وَإِدْبَارُهُمَا بَعْدَ وَضْعِهِمَا فِي التُّرَابِ. And when a person places the hands into the earth, to move his hands forward and move them backwards. وَتَفْرِيجُ أَصَابِعِهِمَا, and likewise spreading of the fingers. وَنَفْضُهُمَا, and to basically get rid of any excess earth or dust or whatever it is that he's using. So after he's placed his hands into the water, he moves them forward, moves them back, and then he makes sure to remove any excess earth, etc. Then he says, now we're on to the next chapter, الطهارة من الخبث. So purification from tangible, literal impurities. He says, والطهارة من الخبث طهارة البدن والثوب والمكان الذي يصلي فيه من النجاسة المانعة. So he has to purify his body, his clothing, and the place of worship from any impurity which has been deemed to be an impurity which would prevent a person from praying with such impurity on their body, clothing, or the place of praying. And of course, this would be decided by the Sharia. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or His Prophet ﷺ, that which has been indicated as being impure, such as alcohol, such as the saliva of particular animals, and so on and so forth. And then he says, ثم نجاسة على قسمين غليظة وخفيفة. There are two types of najasa. So you have impurities which are considered to be heavy impurities and impurities which are considered to be light impurities. What's the difference between the two? The author is going to give indication, inshallah. He says, فالغليظة كالدم السائل وميتة كل ذي دم سائل وبول ما لا يؤكل لحمه ونحوه ولعاب سباع البهائم وخرء الدجاج والبطء والإوز. So he says that the heavy impurities are things such as flowing blood. So blood, as we spoke about in relation to that which would nullify a person's state of ritual impurity, flowing blood. So blood which reaches the surface of the skin and then flows, indicating that it's moved from its place of origin. It's not only been revealed because of the skin having been cut or removed. So flowing blood, it's considered to be a heavy impurity. وَمَيْتَةِ كُلِّ ذِي دَمٍ سَائِلٍ. Likewise, the animal or anything, the creatures that have passed away and they died of natural causes and they have blood. So for example, it would be considered from this cattle and so on and so forth. وَبَوْلِ مَا لَا يُؤْكَلُ لَحْمُ. And animals which are not permissible for us to eat, their urine, so that which they release from their passages, those things are impure. So if a person had, for example, the urine of a predatory animal on their clothing, then they would have to remove that depending on how much is on the clothing. We'll come to that shortly, inshallah, prior to being able to pray. وَنَحْوِهِ. Then he says, وَلُعَابِ سِبَاعِ الْبَهَائِمِ. Likewise, the saliva of, as we mentioned, wild animals. So, for example, you can have a tamed donkey, and then you can have a wild donkey. The wild donkey would be considered from that which is categorized as being from heavy impurities, i.e. its saliva and so on and so forth. وَخُرْءِ الدَّجَاجِ or وَخَرْءِ الدَّجَاجِ, or the excrement of chickens. وَالْبَطِّ وَالْإِوَزْ. likewise ducks, and so on and so forth. And these things, there is a lot more that is discussed in the more advanced books, but as we said, we'll keep it short, as intended by the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, and perhaps it's not too relevant to us, those who live in cities and live in modern settings, because we don't really interact with these animals anymore. Then he says, وَالْخَفِيفَةُ, the light impurities are things such as بَوْلِ الْفَرَسِ, the urine of the horse, وَمَا يُؤْكَلُ لَحْمُ, and that which the meat of this particular animal is eaten, it's edible, it's halal. The urine of such an animal would be considered a light impurity. وَخُرْءِ طِيرٍ لَا يُؤْكَلْ, or طَيْرٍ, sorry, لَا يُؤْكَلْ. Likewise, the impurity released by, or the excrement released by a flying animal, a bird, that is not eaten. So there, as I said, there is detail given. For example, the bird. Why is it that the bird, the excrement of the bird is considered to be light? Because it would be very, very difficult to prevent the excrement of the bird from landing on things. So if you can imagine previously, to protect water, to protect clothing, to protect places where they would be praying, especially if those places are outside, for example, from the excrement of such animals, it would be difficult. And again, it's discussed in more detail in larger books. Then he says, وَالْمَانِعُ مِنَ الْغَلِيظَةِ مَا زَادَ عَلَى قَدْرِ الدِّرْهَمِ. So what is it that is considered to be the threshold of that which would prevent a person from praying if they have on their clothing an element of this particular substance, if it is a heavy impurity? He says, مَا زَادَ عَلَى قَدْرِ الدِّرْهَمِ, that which is more than the equivalent of a dirham in size. So roughly a 50 pence piece. So if a person has more than a 50 pence piece in amount of a heavy impurity on their clothing, on their body, or on the place of prayer, they have to remove that from the said part prior to being able to pray. Then he says, and that's with, remember, the heavy impurity. He says, وَمِنَ الْمُخَفَّفَ or وَمِنَ الْخَفِيفَ مَا بَلَغَ رُبْعَ الثَّوْبِ أو الْبَدَنِ, that which reaches up to a quarter of a piece of clothing or the body. And this is in relation to the clothing, the parts or the limbs. So for example, the arm, the piece of, like from the shoulder to the wrist, would be taken into consideration by its own. So if a quarter of that part of the garment has been affected by or contaminated by a light form of impurity, then that would need to be washed prior to being able to pray with that particular garment. Some of the fuqaha from the madhab, they say it's the entire piece of clothing that's taken into consideration. But the point is that there is a larger, higher threshold for that which is light impurities. Why? Because of, to sum in brief, there are some conflicts in relation to that which has been considered to be from the light impurities. For example, horse meat. Is horse meat permissible to eat, or is it impermissible to eat, and why, and so on and so forth. So because of there is some sort of conflict with the evidences, that which has a conflict in relation to its evidences is considered to be light, and that which the evidences are clear cut, there are no conflicts within the evidences, then they are to be considered from that which is heavy, i.e. heavy impurity. Then he says, وَيَطْهُرُ مُتَنَجِّسٌ بِنَجَاسَةٍ مَرْئِيَّةٍ كَدَمٍ بِزَوَالِ عَيْنِهَا وَلَوْ بِمَرَّةٍ عَلَى الصَّحِيحِ وَلَا يَضُرُّ بَقَاءُ أَثَرٍ شَقَّ زَوَالُهُ. So he says, that which is tangible, and it's got a body to it, it's removed by removing the body of that impurity. So if we can imagine that some sort of physical impurity was on the floor, and the physical impurity had a body. So for example, let's say a bird released some impurity as it was flying over. If we can remove the physical body of that impurity, then we have removed the impurity, and that which remains of color, it doesn't really make a difference, or smell as well. It doesn't make a difference as long as we have removed the physical impurity, even if it's only with one washing. Then he says وغير المرئية بغسلها ثلاثا والعصر كل مرة. As for that which cannot be seen, it doesn't have a body, i.e. it doesn't have a body. So for example, urine, it doesn't have a tangible physical body to it. It's a liquid, a substance. Then it is to wash it 3 times والعصر كل مرة, with a squeezing of the garment that has been contaminated. So why is it that he says 3 times? Because of it's basically ما يغلب على الظن. That's the principle. That which a person finds that they feel it's certain that the impurity has now been removed, and they say that this happens usually with 3 washes. So they made that the number to make it easy for people, 3 times. Why? Because you may have a person who has some sort of OCD, and if he has urine on his clothing, he may want to wash it 10 times, 15 times, because he has an OCD, he has an issue with cleansing, etc. Whereas you might have another person who he has some sort of tasahul, he's very easygoing when it comes to contamination with impure substances on clothing and so on and so forth. So he's not very cautious, and so he might just wash it once and say that's enough. But the balanced approach is to do it 3 times, as that is usually what it requires or takes with a person who has a balanced approach to cleaning. Then he says وتطهر النجاسة بالماء وبكل مائع طاهر مزيل كالخل وماء الورد ونحوهما. So he says that tangible impurities can be washed with anything which is a liquid substance, and it has the ability to remove the impurity, such as vinegar, rose water, وَنَحْوِهِمَا. Likewise, used water, i.e. water which has been used for ablution or ghusl, as long as there is no najasa, impurity remaining in that water. And this is at contrast with the wudu. So the wudu, the ghusl, you can only use pure water which has not been contaminated so much so that it's changed the name, i.e. the name now defines it. So let's say, for example, if you add rose essence to water and the qualities of the rose water or the rose essence overcome the water, that water can no longer be used for wudu or ghusl, but it can be used to purify clothing, a place of worship. Whereas if the essence of the rose does not overcome the water, i.e. its qualities do not transfer into the water, perhaps one of 3 in the case of rose essence, if it's colored, or none of the 2, if there's no color, there's only taste and smell, then you can use that water for wudu and ghusl. Then he says وَتَطْهُرُ he says ونحوهما, and we said such as الماء المستعمل. Then he says وستر العورة تغطيتها بما لا يصف ما تحت ولو بطين أو حرير. So he goes on now to the covering of one's awrah, and this is the condition now for the salah, the second condition after tahara. As we mentioned, that he's only mentioning that which is necessary to know in relation to the condition of tahara for the salah, as this is a book which is meant for the beginner, although it is suitable for revision for the person who has studied something of fiqh. And so we will continue inshallah with the next lesson, looking at the awrah. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.